Why are you studying the rabbi language that was invented yesterday? Jesus didn't use that language. Like, why would they? I don't get it. Everyone grows their beards and runs out and starts studying Hebrew. Hebrew wasn't a language. They just made it up literally yesterday. You're like, well, I want to learn the priestly story. That's like me going and learning Latin because I want to talk to the Vatican about Jesus. Hi, and welcome to our Bible study channel.
Energy. Energy. You cannot fuck with this. Energy. You cannot fuck with this energy. Love to all those in this flesh. All of those who are listening. Don't miss the message, judging me. You cannot fuck with this energy. Energy.
These are videos that go pretty in depth. First thing you should probably do is pause and read our 12 rules for reading biblical text. And if you don't like the 12 rules or you don't understand the 12 rules, well, I don't have time to explain them all. Go back to the book that I wrote and uploaded on this channel, which takes you through the entire arc and how we made these quote unquote 12 rules as a framework of what we found after 7 years digging meticulously and carefully through the text. So if you're confused, go do that. If I refer back, well, that's probably because we actually post these things in order. So they're all done in series. And if you jump in at the middle of a series without any schema or background knowledge, and you get all pissed off, well, that's also not our problem. This is a group where we go line by line, scroll by scroll through the text. Warning, we are not language sensitive, so if you can't handle some cussing, it's not the place for you. We also do not endorse nor approve of pretty much any mainstream theology. So if you're looking for that, also definitely not the place for you. We do a video about the characters that we use in our Bible study series. And the reason we do this is sort of so that they can kind of get in your head. So we do have a video explaining why we chose the people we chose and how their sort of energy characteristics go along with the biblical characters to modernize it for people so they know what the heck we're reading. Clearly, the Roman Church was not doing their job and looking for the lost sheep of the reunited House of David. So that's what we're doing, okay? We're taking that away from them because they screwed it up. The brilliant rabbis also down there in Babylon are also not looking for the lost sheep of the reunited kingdom of David. So you're not going to hear, let's follow Rome. And you're not going to hear, let's follow the rabbis on this channel. Because, you know, sorry, not sorry, but the Bible wasn't actually written for the corrupt Levitical priesthood post-Babylon and Persia to read it through their little janky books. And it also wasn't written to be read through the eyes of pagan 4th century church fathers. So we're not doing that either. You guys can both have a seat. Oddly enough, the Bible also wasn't written to be read through the eyes of some dumbass scholars with pieces of paper that say they're smarter than everyone, but have never seen a Davidic covenant in their life. Not written for them either. You know who it's written for? It's written for the reunited house of David, who are actually in covenant and are actually the sheep. That's who it's written for. That's why nobody else can understand what the heck's going on. What you are going to hear is what you're supposed to hear, which is, let's follow the king. And let's get started.
So, We are going to war.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Okay, we are on, I don't know, maybe Paul's Paganism 10-ish. And we're going to start off with theology is not cosmology. And a lot of people get these two terms sort of kind of confused. And I just want to remind you, the only theology that we have is be in the Davidic Covenant, jurisdiction. That's what the Bible states. That's our theology. So going through our agenda, we've already done our Greek philosophy, the Aramaic Targums, our little scholar quiz, and now we're going to do who are the Hellenists really? The Hellenists are Israel, but not all Israel are Hellenists. After that, we're going to talk about the evolution of the Logos, and we're going to put that together with why did the Hellenists try to kill Paul, and hopefully that'll become obvious. We're going to take a good long look at our Stephen speech, and then with all the background knowledge that we've gathered over the past, 80-something videos. And then finally, we'll end up with comparing resurrection ideas within competing cosmologies. And that one video, we'll wrap that one up with the Davidic Covenant resurrection model and what that looks like. So maybe 3 more until we get back and do some other stuff that's on our agenda, like the prophets, the Solomonic magic piece, and getting back into Luke. So I'm not sure what order we'll go in. Oh, and Samson's in there somewhere too. I'm not quite sure what order we'll go in. But first, I want to go back to this idea that theology is not cosmology. They're 2 different things, and Americans have a real hard time with mixing these categories. We have all kinds of things in our head about Christian cosmology or how the universe works. Christian cosmology is basically the first line. Be in the eternal Son's jurisdiction, this cosmic Christ, this Logos entity, this Son of the Trinity, or else. That's what it is. Everything else, honestly, is debatable, okay? Their belief is as long as you believe. They hide this sentence, be in the eternal Son's jurisdiction, or else. They hide this behind belief, right? If you believe in it, you're automatically in this category, but they're actually using belief as like the dangling carrot to get you into the initiation through the baptism that we've talked about 100, the baptism of death that we've talked about 100 times before. So they're using belief as the carrot, but really, when you boil it down, as long as you believe in the eternal Son and you're in that jurisdiction, you're good. And honestly, in modern Christianity, everything else about their cosmology is debatable. Now, cosmology has to do with how the universe is structured. So this brings in their end time beliefs, denominational hair splitting and arguing, names of Jesus, names of God. How do you do confession or not? Reincarnation, ghosts, afterlife. How do you feel about psychics, ascended masters, Levitical law keeping, charity, mass, prayers, meditation? How are all of these things working together in your mind, regardless of what the average Christian admits to their preacher on Sunday? Does that make sense? None of these things are jurisdictional theology. Okay? Your Levitical law keeping, that's theology. But if you ask, honestly, 100 different Christians what they believe about these things, well, their beliefs are pretty wild and varied. And they do not add up with the official church, quote unquote, doctrine. And that seems, that's a mess, that their cosmologies are clashing. Okay? Their doctrines are clashing. Okay? Especially when you get to the names and the Levitical law pieces, and they're sort of smooshing all of these cosmologies into their ideas and belief systems without realizing that they're simply inventing their own doctrinal theology. The real question to ask is, whose jurisdiction are you in? Everyone wants to change their ideas, change their cosmology, change their doctrine, change their practice. Follow this denomination, follow this early Christian sect, follow this rabbi's opinions, follow this preacher's opinions, follow this channel's opinions, follow this scholar's research. And they're changing their ideas. But what they're not doing is changing the jurisdiction that they're under, because they do not understand ancient Near East and first century categories. They're making category errors. Category errors force them into defining a doctrine. Does that make sense? Churches give doctrines. Priesthoods give doctrines. Cosmologies don't give doctrines. Everyone in America is so belief-based with what do we believe and what do we believe we have to do and say and feel and think, and let's apply that to Jesus. It doesn't work that way. Jesus gave a kingdom, not a doctrine. Jesus gave a kingdom, not a religion. People are very uncomfortable with this. They want a list of things. They want a group to identify with. But that's the whole trick. While people are running around with denominational hair splitting, arguing over names, holidays, Levitical law keeping from the Persian Empire, how to do your prayers, is meditation okay or not okay, and in what context, what does all this mean, how does the end times work, and they're hashing out these arguments. What they're not doing is changing their jurisdiction. They're not changing their jurisdiction from the being under the kingship of one entity to being under the jurisdiction of Jesus, son of David. They're not making that switch. They're changing their language. Instead of Jesus, we'll say Yeshua. Instead of celebrating Christmas, we'll celebrate Passover. Instead of, keeping the 10 Commandments, we'll go ahead and start fishing through sojourner law. But they're not changing their jurisdiction. I'm speaking in covenant categories, not religious, institutional group doctrine. And Americans have a very, very, very hard time with this. I don't care how many PhDs you have after your name. You will not convince me that the Qumran sect of the Dead Sea Scroll people had anything to do with the same cosmology and category as Jesus and James. Why? Because they were literally running about, ritually purifying themselves in order to be able to get closer to the holy host of heaven who was going to join them in a cosmic battle. Okay. Meanwhile, Jesus is running around touching dead bodies, diseased people, and mocking the priesthood. Not once, not twice, but 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 times about how they're obsessed with their purity rituals. And he isn't. You wash the outside of a cup and the inside of the cup is disgusting, right? Whitewashed tombs. He didn't teach the ritual purity of these sects. You know who did? The priesthood. The priesthood that Jesus is fighting against. You can't convince me that authentic first century Jesus followers were in the Davidic Covenant simply because they used the word Jesus. If they're practicing things that go against Jesus's teachings, okay? Like, you can't do that. It doesn't matter, a lot of this vegetarian, someone just left a comment about this vegetarianism thing with the Ebian. Okay, well, I guess if the Ebian were accurate historically and in the Davidic Covenant, and Jesus taught vegetarianism or veganism, then Jesus would be standing on the shores of the Galilee yelling at his apostles to stop fishing. But no, they weren't fishing for seaweed, guys. Like this isn't Jesus. That doesn't mean it's not ethical. That doesn't mean it's not moral. That doesn't even mean you can't do it and follow Jesus and be in the Davidic covenant, right? Or you can do and be in another covenant. You can do food dietary laws all day long and still not be in the Davidic covenant. That's what I'm saying. So were ancient sects aligned with Jesus's teaching? Well, no. David literally sat down, slaughtered an animal, and had tableship covenant with his God. Okay? Passover includes a lamb. If Jesus did not participate in the Passover dinner and refused because of what was on the menu, they would have told us that, okay? He'd be yelling at Simon Peter because he's got fish guts on his shirt. Like this wasn't their world. The purity stuff wasn't their world. It was the priesthood. It was a rival priesthood people. Okay, that's what they were. They were poor priesthood followers without a temple. Okay, like that's what it was. But regardless of their practice, I can't tell you if they're in the Davidic covenant or in the priesthood covenant. I don't know. They're not the same covenant. And I don't have any indication that just because they read a certain gospel or used a certain name or did a certain ritual that the Persian priesthood promoted, that they were Jesus' covenant. Following Jesus and being in Jesus's covenant kingdom are not the same thing. People don't see it because they don't understand category errors. It's okay. It's just not Jesus. It wasn't his cosmology to do ritual bathing, to purify yourself, to be holy, and have troops of angels fighting on your side. This is not his cosmology. Therefore, there was no doctrine made about that worldview. If you take a look at this photo, right? We've got theology, which determines cosmology and vice versa. Okay? But we're going to move that cosmology piece to the underbelly of that iceberg. Okay? Cosmology, and this is just one of them. It's just an example. I'm not saying this is my cosmology or it's a valid cosmology. It's just an example. Okay? Cosmology is how the universe works. Layers of reality, layers of the universe. Theology is your church, institutional, personal doctrines based on your beliefs of things you can see and understand. And oftentimes, there's a lot underneath it. So if we just move our cosmology, how we believe the world operates, and move that to the unseen iceberg, right? Our beliefs now come out of our personal cosmology, and we make a theology based on our personal view of the universe, how it works, and what our ethics are. And that theology, for all of Christianity, goes right to the eternal Son's jurisdiction. No matter what your theology is, no matter what your cosmology is, no matter what you believe, if you're doing that in the eternal Son's jurisdiction, you are not in Davidic covenant jurisdiction. I don't care. I don't care about anything else. Okay? From names to languages to doctrines to hand washing to psychics to witch, I don't care. Any of it. Solomonic magic. The theology that we're basing our entire worldview on. Okay, here's our theology in one sentence. Be in Davidic jurisdiction, period. And most people don't know what that means because they think, oh, that's a fancy word for following Jesus. No, it's a jurisdictional kingdom covenant. And most people don't know what it is, nor do they go into that covenant jurisdiction legally in a legal binding covenant with Jesus, the King, and God in a Davidic covenant. They don't do that. They don't switch their jurisdiction. So all these things that they're doing and believing, well, they're doing what, good, bad, or ugly, they're doing and believing under the eternal Son jurisdiction or the jurisdiction of something else. And we don't know what those are. We don't know what those are. And the Davidic jurisdiction is not the Levitical priesthood jurisdiction. If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. So what we're doing is instead of learning about our cosmology and applying that back to Jesus and our ethics and applying that to Jesus, what we strive to do is not tell anyone what to do or believe. We really try hard to do that. We're saying be in the Davidic covenant first. Until then, you're not going to get it. You're just not going to get it because you're under a different jurisdiction. Then we're attempting to reconstruct his cosmology, not ours. And the reason we do that is because once you're in the Davidic jurisdiction, we don't want to wander out of jurisdiction because of personal belief or ritual. We're not doing either one of those. Okay? We don't want to do those. We don't want to wander out of our covenant because we think or do things wrong based on a flawed category or a flawed cosmology. The jurisdiction I don't want to be in is Paul's, Rome's. The other jurisdiction that I have absolutely zero interest in being in is the Levitical priesthoods. Neither of those. Okay? Audit Rome, please do the homework and audit Babylon, where all of these quote unquote Mosaic laws come from. It's Persia saying Moses said so. Now, I make these claims, right? I'm not going to give you 57,000 scholars to back these claims. When I say the Persians wrote the civil law Torah, I mean that. Go look it up. It's there. It's like it's in the public domain. I'm not interested in being in a Levitical priesthood any more than I'm in the jurisdiction of Rome. They're two incorrect jurisdictions that are not the Davidic covenant jurisdiction. It's not my covenant. Does that make sense? So we're trying to reconstruct the worldview. I can learn more from Elijah and David by reading it through their worldview lens than through mine. Same with Jesus. Same with James. Same with any of the prophets. All through history. I can learn more about Paul, understanding his cosmology and his time in history, than I can reading church fathers from 1576 or 1983. I have to rebuild their worldview and their understanding of their culture, their traditions, why they believed what they believed, why they did what they did, why they didn't do what they didn't do, to understand and frame it, to be able to empathize with these characters in their culture, in their worldview. Doctrine, theology, right now that's irrelevant because people are out there joining groups, joining sects, and doing all kinds of things while not being in Davidic covenant. Like you're not there. They don't know the story yet. We're adding sprinkles on the cupcake. We don't know the cupcake. We don't know the whole story. So we're going to clear up a category error today about the Hellenists. And that's where we're going next. Who are the Hellenists? Well, we've got 3 different answers to this question. Answer A is this is what your post-exile, and when I say post-exile, let me define that. Persian, Hasmonean, Rabbinic propaganda says the Hellenists were. Now, this is the official story that got baked into Maccabees, Josephus, who is a nefarious character, okay? A lot of people love to pull from Josephus when they like what he says and ignore Josephus when they don't like what he says. But this was a shifty guy. Keep that in mind. something about tree fruit. There you go. And later rabbinic memory and Christian retellings. Okay. So according to that worldview, these are traitors to the Torah, Greek-loving compromisers. They were simply assimilated, quote-unquote, Jews who abandoned the covenant. Shame on those Hellenists. They were idol-friendly, gymnasium-loving, philosophy bro degenerates, and definitely enemies of the Second Temple. Oh, that says reading text reading rest. No, it's supposed to say text reading reset, but my E key is sticky and clearly didn't work. So this is where my Middle East brain section is doing what it was trained to do by living overseas for so long. I see factions. I see jurisdictions, power blocks, worldview clusters, rival cosmologies, and competing legitimacy claims. But this is not how American brains think at all, in any way, shape, or form. They don't see this. So we're going to map this clearly because it's one of the biggest reasons that our biblical work makes sense to us and feels strange, blasphemous, or like witchcraft to others. They don't understand thinking in categories. Trying to get an American to view in categories is like trying to talk someone out of Republican Democrat binary. They'll say a little cute meme like, oh, two wings of the same bird. But then they go right back to arguing about Republicans, Democrats. Like they can't pull themselves out of that system. Same thing with Jew and Gentile, Jew and Christian, priesthood 1 and priesthood 2, okay? But Middle East thinking doesn't ask these questions. It says, what faction is this? You automatically ask, living over there, you automatically ask different questions. Who are these people aligned with? What worldview do they have and cosmology do they assume? What power structure? What rival group do they oppose? What jurisdiction do they claim? What is their household, village culture? What is their ancestry? What cosmologies have they adopted and syncretized with? Were they educated in the West or in the East? This is how the ancient world worked. This is how the biblical world worked. This is not how Americans are reading the text. But this is how the Middle East still works today. With American thinking, it's which group am I supposed to join? Which denomination gets this right? What am I supposed to believe? Americans are trained to think in that vertical culture with which group aligns with my beliefs, my cosmology, if you will, because beliefs matter or else. They've been trained that your beliefs matter or else. That's not ancient Near East. That's not David's world, and that's not Jesus's world. And Americans have such a hard time with this. Well, we don't align with Paul because Paul teaches belief. Okay, but now you just believe that you have to do behavior. Like that's like, what is your belief about the law and behavior? What is your belief about, the virgin birth or not? It's because you don't believe in the virgin birth that changes your jurisdiction? No, it changes your belief. Because you don't believe that grace saves you alone, grace alone. You don't believe in that? So then you do something else. But you didn't change your jurisdiction. You just changed your belief. Oh, you switched from this end times cosmology to this end times cosmology. Well, you just changed your belief. You didn't change your jurisdiction. Okay? They think in denominations, brands, labels, and identities. That's not the Middle East world or the ancient Near East world. It just isn't. So when I say the Hellenists are the closest worldview match to Jesus, people would come after me and immediately say, she said Jesus is Greek. She said you have to be a Hellenist. She said if you want to follow Jesus, you should be a Hellenist. That's how they see it. I have to group myself with the Hellenists because she said they're the closest worldview. No, that's not. She said Jesus was Greek. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying their worldview, their cosmology is the closest match. Two different statements. Americans can't hear it because they're thinking in group identity is true and this group identity is false. They're asking, where's their church? Where's their doctrine? What's their statement of faith? Who's their leader? Where's their headquarters? What rules did they follow? What were their rituals? Because Americans think group identity is truth, which is authentic. That is not covenant thinking. It's not. Middle East thinking, on the other hand, is completely different. It's a whole different category. They think faction, worldview, and jurisdiction. That is covenant thinking. Completely opposite worlds. It's a totally different mental software. Now, in Middle East thinking, they see power structures, factions, not belief. You learn who has authority, legitimacy, and jurisdiction, who has the right to enforce, who's aligned with whom. It's political, not belief-based. So when I read Acts 9, right, you'll see the way we break down Acts 9. Hellenists versus Judean priesthood. Saul as an agent of the temple faction. Stephen as a threat to the southern worldview. Diaspora Israelites versus Jerusalem. All these things come into play. This is not what Americans see. And they most certainly don't see Davidic Covenant versus post-exile priestly rewrite. They don't see Davidic versus Targum cosmology. It's a totally different worldview in approaching the text. Here, thanks to our scholars, here's what Americans see. Christians versus Jews. Believers versus unbelievers. Good guys versus bad guys. Literally, those categories. And then, well, she said Jesus was Greek. They don't have the categories. And now that we got that far, well, they go one step further and flatten everything, cosmology, factions, into moral categories and simplify it. But I see political factions, not what do I believe to get a ticket to heaven. Because, well, that's how the ancient world actually worked. The Middle East thinking sees worldview clusters, cosmology clusters, ancestry, not religion. Sunni versus Shia, Wahhabi and Sufi, Egyptian Islam versus Gulf Islam. Literally, the list is endless. An Egyptian Muslim and a Qatari Muslim, two different universes, okay? Bedouin tribes versus my friends from Lebanon. State Islam versus folk Islam versus what is happening in their households, all different. And Americans say, traitor, she lived in the Middle East and is trying to be Muslim. They don't have the category. So when I'm reading the New Testament, I see Hellenists, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Herodians, political motives, ancient cosmologies that are completely clashing, ancient traditions, cultural dynamics, the Judean priesthood that Jesus actually fought, okay? Galilean covenant groups, diaspora synagogues that were independent of the temple. And someone in Crete did not have the same worldview as someone in Syria or Egypt. You can't compare them unless you know their worldview. You've got the temple here on the left. These are temple-affiliated groups. And on the other side, we've got non-temple affiliated groups, okay? But the funny part, this is what your trusty institutional religious leaders and your Western scholars have collapsed into quote-unquote Jewish. But even within the temple loyal sect, you might have Pharisee twice, okay? Because these Pharisees don't agree with those Pharisees and they have a completely different worldview. Over on the other side, you have different sectarian groups that completely don't agree and have completely different covenants and cosmologies and practices and rituals and beliefs and family traditions. They're not a monolithic group. And they've been erased and collapsed into a category to support modern institutionalized religion. And people don't see it. They're operating in a massive category error. Americans see quote unquote Jews, that's it. Nothing else. They see Jews. And Jews mean Levitical priesthood of the first century, the institutionalized religion of the first century. That's it. One label, one group, one blob, one monolithic practice with one monolithic culture. That's it. That's all they see. Why are you combining 12 factions with regional and cultural diversity and completely incompatible cosmologies? Why? Mishmashed with this giant category collapse, and it doesn't make sense. Ancient Near East thinking and some Middle East thinking sees texts as factional propaganda, not a perfectly aligned holy book. Every single text has a political purpose, a cosmology, a worldview, a narrative with a factional agenda. Just like if churches were putting out doctrinal statements today, you have to know who's saying what. Every story is written from a side, and every side has another side, and every side has enemies. So when you read Matthew, what I see is this is a Judean post-exile temple-aligned propaganda with really, really sloppy midrash. That's what I see. Americans see this is the most Hebrew gospel. Yeah, if the Hebrew was drunk at a Caligula party, right? It's not really. Not if you mean Hebrew as in Davidic Covenant. Only if you see Hebrew as really, really bad priesthood propaganda and terrible references of prophecy fulfillment. I say this, Americans lose their mind, but it's true. Ancient Near East, Middle East thinking sees authorship as irrelevant. There are scholars out there wasting ink on who wrote what, and Christians are clutching their pearls because if Matthew didn't actually write Matthew, then it's not authentic. Because names are fluid, stories circulate, sayings get attributed, authorities collected. Oral tradition is normal. But Christian identity relies on John the Apostle absolutely wrote this, and we're going to write 3,000 million pages about that. Not taking culture into account, that's called apologetics, and it's not good doctrine. So over there, everything is in factions, worldviews, cosmologies, jurisdictions, and syncretism. The Bible was written in that world, not ours. So if you read it like an American, you're going to miss the structure. If you read it like someone from the ancient Near East, the whole thing suddenly makes sense. We're not doing apologetics. We're not doing doctrine. And that's why our work lands differently and people can't hear us. What to believe, what rituals to follow versus what jurisdiction are you in? I can break bread with my king all day and call it communion. Or I can swallow a wafer and become one with an entity and call it communion. The label communion means nothing unless you know who, why, what culture, what jurisdiction. And you take that idea and apply it to every single text ever, you're halfway there. Category collapse example, ritual bathing. This is a religious act, and it shows how modern people totally lose the plot when they collapse jurisdiction, cosmology, culture, and custom into one fuzzy label. Think of the wait staff cannot return to the kitchen without washing your hands sign. In the temple system, bathing was jurisdictional compliance, not spiritual hygiene. It's a legal readiness to enter sacred space under priestly authority. The temple is a legal zone. Impurity is simply a jurisdictional disqualification. Washing restores eligibility to enter the space, like renewing your visa before crossing a border or washing your hands before returning to the kitchen. It's bureaucratic, not mystical. You can't enter until your status is clear. So temple bathing is legal purification, not baptism, not spiritual mysticism. But in the non-temple world, well, it's completely different. The non-temple world has a totally different view and cosmology. Essenes and Qumran, their ritual purity is angelic protection, washing before meals or prayer so the holy hosts can approach and commune. Pharisees, they're doing that fence building to keep themselves separate from the quote-unquote Gentiles, who are really northern Israel. The purity is extended to daily life to imitate priestly holiness because, well, the priesthood they were working with them and they were their rivals. The Hellenists see it as a symbolic renewal, a moral, philosophical cleansing. The Israelite Jews were civic adaptation. They're washing before synagogue as a cultural identity marker to set themselves apart as a group. Each faction was repurposing the act to fit its own worldview. In Jesus's Davidic Covenant logic, well, it's something else entirely. We have a whole third category. He's not saying wash to be holy, wash so the host of heaven can come and battle next to you, wash to enter sacred space. He's teaching exactly the opposite of these things. Bathing isn't baptism. Okay? He's saying, enter my kingdom. Baptize and change your jurisdiction for forgiveness of sins. Because he's your king. He will mediate on your behalf. So let's take a look at all of these categories that are based on cosmology and belief, not covenant. And tell me what they all have in common. Our temple legality, our angelology, our Pharisee imitation, our Hellenistic symbolism, our Christian cosmic rebirth, or even this idea of some kind of community hygiene to avoid disease. What they all have in common is not a single one of them says, enter the kingdom, pledge allegiance to the king from the Galilee, change your jurisdiction, the kingdom is at hand. So in modern times, when you ask someone, why are we doing this? They don't know which jurisdiction they're in. They're mixing 5, 6, 3, 7 incompatible cosmologies and incompatible jurisdictions and smooshing them together and saying it's Jesus. So let's do a Follow Jesus lens shift worksheet of sorts, okay? This is a way to flip your brain when you're reading text. It's a quick diagnostic to read like someone in Jesus's world. The first question you ask is, what world are we in? Before even remotely attempting to interpret any passage, let's just read it and research the vocabulary and terms, shall we? And you can do this across any text. Identify the world and the cosmology it assumes. Circle 1, Galilee, Judea, independent synagogues, cosmology, regional culture, temple priesthood, tribal, Davidic, covenant logic. Where are we? If we're in an independent synagogue, are we in Crete or are we in Egypt? Or are we in northern Turkey? Because they're really, really different. Question number 2. Whose faction is this? Not what religion, not what theology, not what practices, not what belief, not what denomination, not which group today matches this. None of that. What faction? Identify the faction inside the story and check all that apply. Are they Hellenists? Are they Pharisees? Are they Sadducees? Are they Judean? Is this an independent synagogue? If it's an independent synagogue, where is it? And finally, what jurisdiction is being modeled? Are they under a priesthood jurisdiction? And if so, who? We're not asking if it's true or false. We're not asking if it's right or wrong. We're not asking heaven or hell. We're not asking how do we get to heaven. That's not what we're asking. The first thing to determine is whose authority is in play. Which covenant are they under? Which benefits and obligations come with that covenant ruler? Which territory does this worldview belong to? And where did they inherit their cosmology? If you can't name the jurisdiction, you're missing the entire structure. So if you can't answer all three of those questions, you're not reading the text through the ancient Near East lens. And that means you may think you're following Jesus, however you choose to define that, but you're not identifying his covenant. So back to answer A. What these post-exile Persian Hasmonean rabbinic propaganda says the Hellenists were is enemies of the priesthood, of course. They're the historical villains in the Maccabean revolt, as far as they are. They're enemies of quote-unquote true Judaism. The reason Israel almost lost its identity in basically Romans and Jewish clothing. The tale is, don't be like them. But this is a propaganda version, the one that paints the Hellenists as the bad guys who tried to destroy the priesthood from within. Now, that's their historical story from their worldview, which is like, CNN, Fox News institutionalized story within their institutionalized religion. But who they really were historically, according to actual historians, is they were Israelites, not Jews. Jews meaning Judean priesthood aligned, Second Temple. They were descendants of the northern tribes, displaced all the way back, starting with Assyria. So we've got generational displacement. They're also descendants of the Judeans' location with Babylon. They're synagogue-centered. They're not Levitical temple-centered. They're Greek-speaking, but covenant-minded. I think of these as the kids in my school who were Western educated in American curriculum or British curriculum, but they were Saudi nationals. They have a very different worldview. They have a combined worldview, unlike your Saudi Bedouin old guy sitting out in a tent in a village. Completely different worldviews, educations, and cosmologies. They may even have very different customs, practices, and clearly traditions and family traditions going on in each different region. Now, here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. They were loyal to the older Hebrew story, not the Persian rewrite. Let's stop and think about this, guys. Okay, this isn't rocket science. If they were dispersed with Assyria, starting with Assyria, before the Persians came on the scene and rewrote the stuff, right, with the Second Temple, they were long gone before the Second Temple. That means their family traditions, their history, their tribal memory, who they are, is from before Persia. So their story is older than the Second Temple. These guys are users of the Septuagint, not the Aramaic Targums. They are anti-temple bureaucracy, and this part that's underlined is so important. They're anti-Hasmonean priest-king merger. We have talked about this before, where the Levitical priesthood was not only not given land and talking to the second voice and told in Genesis 49, don't pitch your cart to their horse, although I don't know why everyone's out there pitching their cart to the Levitical temple horse and the rabbinic horse that came out of the Pharisees, that came out of Persia. I don't know why they're doing this. It literally says in the Bible, don't do that. Okay? Jesus said, don't do that. They didn't believe in the priest-king merger that came along in the Second Temple period. These are the guys who preserved the pre-exile world view. That would be Davidic. These are the ones who resonated with Jesus and Stephen, and the ones who recognized Davidic logic, not Levitical priesthood institutional Judaism logic. This doesn't mean run out and be a Hellenist, but these are the ones who rejected the Solomonic Edomite hybrid system. In other words, they weren't just Greek hobbyists, Jim Bros, or degenerate philosophers. They were literally the remnant of Israel outside of the Levitical Persian Edomite Second Temple system. And that is dangerous. But that's also why Jesus' message hits them like a tuning fork. Now, our next major problem, well, this is who modern scholars pretend the Hellenists were. This is the academic performance version where they trot out their PhDs, and basically the underlying message they won't say out loud is, please don't destabilize the institutional religions of Judaism or Christianity. That's this version. They typically portray Hellenists, quote unquote, Greek-speaking, quote unquote, Jews, temple aligned, living outside of Judea. That's it. Nothing to see here. They're culturally Greek, but religiously, quote unquote, Jewish. That word again. Temple aligned elite. Elite class. They're just a harmless linguistic subgroup that followed the elites. They're not politically different from Judeans. They're temple aligned with the faction. Nothing to see here. They're not prophetically different. They're not historically distinct. They're not tied to the northern tribes. They're not a threat to the temple system. No, no, no. They all just go right along with the elite Edomite, Levite takeover, king priesthood merger. They're certainly not a remnant of pre-exile Israel. They're basically just Jews with a better Western education. They're a neutral category. Nothing to see here. And here's the big one. They're absolutely not the lost sheep of the house of Israel that Jesus was talking about. Because as soon as they admit that, the entire continuity myth collapses. Now, when I say continuity myth, what do I mean? I mean the temple priesthood continues right along to the Roman priesthood. That's the continuity. Elite structure institution to elite structured institution. My cat is making so much noise in the background, so I completely apologize. But I want you to sit with this statement. The entire continuity myth collapses from temple priesthood to Roman priesthood. And in the middle of those, there was this Wild West. We'll say from 70 AD, even before, to Constantine, even before and after. But there was this time where there was no one priesthood faction completely in control. And this is where you're finding all of this quote unquote first, second century Christianity, quote unquote. But let me say it cleanly for those in the back of the class. The continuity myth is a priesthood pipeline. It is not Davidic, it is not covenant, and it is not Jesus. So you've got all of these factions doing all of these different things and vying in a power vacuum. And most of the writings that you're going to find in that time is a priesthood pipeline. And once you see that, their whole argument falls apart like wet cardboard. We need the myth of institution to institution, and nothing in between. Don't look there. Everything falls into those two categories, Jew and Christian. Because if they don't, the institutional priesthood has a very big problem. And quote unquote, institutionalized Judeo-Christian values as one straight handoff completely falls apart. And this is the part that can blow people's minds because it's so obvious once you say it out loud. So I want you to read these statements. Temple priesthood controlled access to God. It's our God now, you can't have him. That's what they did. That's what all priesthoods do across all time. That's what denominations do. That's what doctrine does. Temple priesthood controlled purity. They controlled sacrifice. The priesthood controlled scripture, the official narrative. They controlled forgiveness. And they controlled the calendar. Does this sound familiar? Because this is a specific jurisdiction, a Levitical priesthood jurisdiction, and it wasn't Jesus's jurisdiction. He had his own jurisdiction that wasn't this. Okay? Now you're going to see on the left the same exact list, but when the Catholic Romans come along, same power structure handed from priesthood to priesthood. But that's not the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing is what we hit in our Mayhem series, and we purposely still haven't put it up yet because American brains don't yet have the categories, because you have to understand there's this mosh pit, this liminal space, if you will, this wild west of years. We're going to call it, this is rule of thumb, okay? It's before and it's after, but generally speaking, we'll just say 70 AD to Constantine, okay? Between those two, you've got a priesthood power vacuum. Put those words, priesthood power vacuum, in the context of Middle East politics, factions, ideologies, cosmologies. Think of the Middle East today and how it operates with different factions of control politically. Well, there was no separation between church and state, guys. This wasn't a bunch of hippy-dippy people running out in 300 years and like, oh, we saw Jesus. Let's just be great people. These are people competing for political dominance and survival in a system where there's no separation of church and state. And there is not a single person out there talking about quote unquote first century and quote unquote second century, quote unquote Christianity that's even remotely touching this part of reality. Okay, they're in fantasy land. They're picking random documents with scraps of this and scraps of that, looking at modern scholars and pagan church fathers, okay, and leftover Levitical power play people jockeying for position. There is no writing of your commoners hanging out in a small village doing what they're doing. You can tell by their doctrines, okay? These are edited. They've got 1,000 different cosmologies, a bazillion different cultures, ancestry, worldviews, all over. But this is the place that Christians instantly go to be quote unquote authentic. But the problem with authentic is authentic according to who? They're thinking in Western doctrine and Western denomination. What 0 people are doing, 0 people except us, are asking the only question that matters, is how do the documents in this Wild West mosh pit of liminal space-time, where there is no centralized priesthood, put all the documents on the table and ask yourself this. Forget doctrine. How does this document, the author of this document, and their worldview, their cosmology, their culture, their ancestry, their area of the world, where are they? Ask those 3 questions we laid out before. How does it compare to the Davidic jurisdictional spine of the story? We don't care how Levitical it is. If it's Levitical, it's in the old priesthood worldview. It's in the priesthood jurisdiction. If it's Roman, it's in their jurisdiction. You've got 2 jurisdictions of institutional theology and control, Levitical and Roman. Anything in between? The question to ask is not, how do I agree or disagree with them? The question is, how do their writings compare to Jesus's jurisdiction, which is not Levitical priesthood and isn't Roman priesthood either? That's the question that nobody's asking. And that's the question, I argue, nobody can answer, because nobody knows the entire biblical story. They're running around pulling clips from modern scholars and modern Protestants with an agenda, with a worldview, with a belief system. Not a single one of them can go back and analyze Micah, Amos. None of them. Half of them haven't even figured out there's two houses yet. But they're going to run off and dig through Levitical law. How are you going to dig through Levitical law when you haven't even figured out that Judah and Israel kingdoms are different, with completely different people and completely different prophecies? But you're going to haul off and tell me what Isaiah said? It's absurd. You have to learn the story first and Jesus's jurisdiction first. And once you have all of that, well, now we can look at the opinions of someone in the 2nd century or the 3rd century or the 1600s. But we're not there yet. And I would argue not a single person out there is there yet either, because they still don't know the story. They still don't know the jurisdiction, and they're still not comparing any writings in this liminal space between priesthood handoffs, between institutional control. They're not asking of any of these authors, how does it compare to the Davidic jurisdictional spine rather than the Levitical one and rather than the Roman one? Because they're not in the middle jurisdiction. They're running from Rome to Babylon, from priesthood to priesthood, and they're still caught in the maze. So our Mayhem series goes through all of these things, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the writings of the early folks between the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, all the edits, all that stuff that everybody else loves to do, right? Digging through all the proof texts and he said, she said, and Augustine versus Faustus, and the Essenes and the Nazarites, all these people, okay? All that stuff, okay? But we don't do, what we do is we'll take, like, there's a story in the Clementine literature, okay? And we look at the century it was written and what that means and what their worldview is and what cosmologies and paganisms and ancestry they come from, because that matters, okay? And after we establish that, we zone in on some really cool stories. Like one of them is when Simon Magus / Saul of Tarsus / Paul, some argue all the same person, right? And we go through that. And we look in the Clementines, there's this awesome scene where Peter is fighting with the Saul character, and they're arguing about the nature of God. And the Saul character actually starts fighting back to Peter and pushing back and saying, I'm going to prove that your God and my God aren't the same God. And you heard and understood Jesus wrong, because God cannot be just and good at the same time. That piece alone, we can spend months on once you understand the categories. But there's guys out there reading this stuff and building doctrines about this stuff, and they don't know what the Targum says. They don't know what worldview Paul's operating from. They don't know the Davidic jurisdictional piece. They're not seeing the cosmology, the year, who wrote it, why they wrote it, where it came from. So they're not analyzing the author to begin with. Never mind the supposed worldview of the characters that they're writing about. None of this is taken into play. It's just, we're going to pick this out because we don't like Paul, and this is a story exposing Paul, so it proves us right. That's not the way to read this literature. You're ignoring audience, culture, history, archaeology, textual criticism, timeline, cosmology, jurisdiction, authority, priesthood optics, power vacuums. There's so much that's missed. That's how we handle these documents in the Mayhem series. That's also why we haven't done it yet, because we're going slowly to build background and schema, because boy, do we tackle it differently. All right, so what you're doing is you're watching 3 different universes: the propaganda universe, Hellenists or traders; historical universe, Hellenists, Diaspora Israel, preserving the older covenant identity. And the academic universe was just, the Hellenists are Greek-speaking Jews. Nothing to see here. Please don't ask about the northern tribes. Now, when I say historically, they're this. What's your evidence? Well, we've got a whole lot, guys. Okay. The books have been written about the Hellenists. Nobody wants to look there because they're either trusting the scholars or trusting the temple propaganda. So we've got a lot of historical evidence behind the text itself, and it shows that they were Greek-speaking and used Greek scripture, not Aramaic, not quote-unquote Hebrew, which I do not believe there's any such thing as ancient Hebrew. I do not. It's Phoenician, okay? But a lot of people believe that ancient Hebrew is a thing, language-wise. Not Targums. They didn't use any of that. They used the Septuagint. That's why Jesus quotes the Septuagint. People don't like that. People like to ignore the fact that Jesus used the Septuagint. Well, that's all he had. Really? Really? The same people that tell you he's God incarnate and can do any miracles, he couldn't get a hold of another written text. It's ridiculous. We've also got Samaritan evidence. Just the fact that the Samaritans exist is really, really inconvenient for the scholars because they used a quote-unquote Torah, but not the Judean one. They preserved a totally different Torah, completely rejected the Jerusalem priesthood, rejected the post-exile reforms, quote-unquote, and preserved older Israelite traditions. So this just proves that the Targum-using Judeans were one small group with a lot of political power, not the whole. Okay? This was your 1%, if you will, we're at the temple. That doesn't represent the whole. The elite class. The elite class, the institution, never represents the commoners. It doesn't today, and it didn't then. Third, we've got that darn linguistic evidence, that scientific linguistic evidence that nobody wants to pay attention to. The Phoenician was dying in Judea, but Greek was thriving. By the 2nd century, Aramaic is the street language, and Greek was the language of trade administration and Israelite life outside of Judea. And this language issue becomes a big problem. This is why the priesthood used the Targums. Your diaspora Israelites used the Septuagint. They were two completely different populations of people in two very different linguistic worlds. And this is a huge problem, guys. This is something that's so obvious, but nobody says it out loud. The Hasmoneans persecuted the Hellenizers. They weren't Greeks, they weren't pagans. They were Greek-speaking, Greek-educated Israelites, expats, right? Often from diaspora families, aligned with the older Israelite traditions before the Second Temple priesthood took over. They were often anti-temple bureaucracy. And you have to remember, guys, the Hasmoneans ruled after Persia. Okay? The Persians lasted about 200 years. Then we have a Hellenistic period. Then the Hasmoneans take over. Okay? And the Hasmoneans are just about less than 100 years before Jesus. So he's born, right, 167 BC, 164 BC. That's not that long before Jesus comes on the scene. Okay? I mean, it's long enough, but it's fresh in their collective memory. The Maccabean propaganda paints them as traitors because they have to. They're in charge now, right? They're the political party in charge. But they were legal Judeans who didn't accept the new Persian Edomite priesthood system. So in other words, well, they were Israel. They didn't believe in priest kings ruling over them. So the Hasmoneans hated them. We have demographic evidence beyond the text itself. 80 to 90% of quote unquote, what your scholars call Jews, lived outside of Judea. This is huge, guys. By the time of Jesus, only 10 to 20% of the people your scholars call quote unquote Jews lived in Judea. The vast majority, from north and south, peasantry, lived in Greek-speaking communities far, far away with nothing to do with the temple. Their Bible was the Septuagint. Their worldview was pre-rabbinic. Their identity was Israelite, not Jewish. This means, it's so obvious when you say it out loud, guys. The Targum using Judeans aligned with the temple in Jerusalem were the minority. The Septuagint using diasporic communities, independent of the temple, was the majority. This fact alone destroys the one coherent Judaism myth. But everyone runs from Rome straight into the arms of the other priesthood. Starts digging through Levitical laws, ritual bathing. I don't know why. Christians leave Rome and ask, how can we be Jewish like Jesus and call it Hebrew? He wasn't Jewish. Jewish means temple aligned. Forget the priesthood tightrope from one priesthood to the other priesthood. Even when people dig around in the 1st through 3rd centuries, they're digging around and find priesthood literature. Be like, oh, this is what it is. No, it's still the priesthood. How can you not see it? They don't see it. Forget the priesthoods. Out of the frying pan into the fire. Philo, our good friend Philo of Alexandria, all of his writings confirm there's actually a Greek-speaking Israelite world that has nothing to do with the temple. He quotes the Septuagint constantly. He never quotes the quote-unquote ancient Hebrew Bigfoot scrolls because there is no such thing as ancient Hebrew scrolls. They just don't exist because there's no ancient Hebrew language, so there's no scrolls. He never mentions the Targums. He describes a Judaism that is not temple-centric, one that is philosophical, Israelite, expat-based, and much older than the temple itself. Josephus, who I have mixed feelings about him, I don't take Josephus's quote-unquote history at face value. Okay, this guy had a lot of motives, and you got to understand the motives. You can't just use Josephus when you like him and not use him when you don't like him. Okay, he's a shady character. But he describes Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, independent communities, Samaritans, and he says they don't all use the same scriptures or interpretive traditions. This is historical, not theological. What other evidence do we have? Who are the Hellenists? These people were witnesses to the existence of a massive Greek-speaking Israelite world that modern scholars pretend didn't exist. Who does know that it existed? The people. The people. So they run to two groups, hell bent on erasing them, the rabbis and the scholars. Who knows that lost Israel exists in the world? The people. Christians know. But instead of running and studying Jesus and his worldview and his cosmology in the ancient Near East, they run straight down the priesthood tightrope and go straight to the rabbis and scholars, the same two groups that insist you don't exist. And once you hit a rabbi or a scholar, they're going to shuffle you into the Levitical priesthood or the Roman priesthood. Neither is Jesus. Why? Why do people go to rabbis and scholars? Why don't they trust themselves and follow the king? American vertical culture. They assume institutional people are experts. And they're stuck in the thinking of Protestant rightism. I have to be right. So they change their language. They change their beliefs. They change their rituals. But they never think of changing their jurisdiction or even their worldview. They stay under the same jurisdiction. They go from one priesthood to the other. So how do scholars even get away with denying this? Well, guys, we have an academic sleight of hand going on. They collapse all Israelite identity into Jewish, okay? And they pretend it's all one big happy family. Even though your Israelites does not equal Judean, which does not equal Samaritan, which doesn't even remotely look like Davidic ancient Near East. Ancient Near East cosmology, Pharisee cosmology, temple cosmology, Roman cosmology, and Egyptian cosmology, not even remotely the same thing, because they just slop it all together. The Septuagint is not the Targum. Quote unquote ancient Hebrew language that doesn't exist, it's Phoenician. It's not Aramaic, and it's not Greek. So we have all of these differing things. And they're like, nope, all the same. It's just Jewish. They slap a Jewish label on all of this diversity. Now they're just Jewish. Make it all one group. And surprise, that monolithic group is controlled by the, look, elites. It's all just Jewish, and it's not you. It's their God now. You can't have him. They treat the Septuagint. This one's interesting. Scholars treat the Septuagint as Christian to avoid Israelite origins. This is the biggest and sneakiest dodge. Because if you sit and think for a minute, the Septuagint was the scriptures that Jesus used. Jesus wasn't Christian. The Septuagint isn't Christian. It's Israelite. But if the scholars say that, well, you'd ask for Hebrews preserved older traditions than the temple did. Because Jesus's Bible was the Septuagint. Even Paul used the Septuagint. And that means Israelites were using the Septuagint, and Rabbinic Judaism and the Levitical temple is not the sole heir, nor the sole doler outer of we know the real truth of ancient Israel. They're not the sole heirs. They're not the only ones that get to tell the story anymore. They're no longer the experts on first century or the Old Testament, which is why I've been saying since we started, the Bible wasn't written for the rabbis, guys. It was written for the sheep. By the sheep, for the sheep. Rabbinic Judaism, Second Temple period people. They're not the sole heir of ancient Hebrewism. They're hardly on the map until Christians handed it to them because they got lost and don't know their categories. They chased the cosmic Christ out into the world and forgot. That's what happened. They're just like, okay, we'll take it. So they pretend that the Septuagint is Christian, even though it was created by the Israelites centuries before Christianity. Shame on you, scholars. They treat Targums as ancient, authoritative, protecting the rabbinic continuity myth. Or they ignore it altogether and like, don't look there. Even though they're late, paraphrases, and controlled by priests. It's post-exile theology, and nobody used them outside of Judea. They're trying to avoid political implications, because if they admit that your scattered Israel is an older tradition, and of course it's older, it's pre-Assyria, then the Judean priesthood is nothing more than a Persian-era innovation. A post-exile rewrite. But the Septuagint is pre-rabbinic Israelite scripture. But for some reason, all the Christians want to run out and start speaking Masoretic Hebrew instead of Greek. Why are you studying the rabbi language that was invented yesterday? Jesus didn't use that language. Like, why would they? I don't get it. Everyone grows their beards and runs out and starts studying Hebrew. Hebrew wasn't a language. They just made it up literally yesterday. You're like, well, I want to learn the priestly story. That's like me going and learning Latin because I want to talk to the Vatican about Jesus. Well, I'm having trouble with my Christian faith, so I'm going to go study Latin so I can talk to the Vatican priesthood and straighten it out. Well, I'm going to go learn Hebrew to talk to the rabbis to straighten it out. Like, what are you doing? The Levitical priesthood down there. You guys, I'm telling you, this Hebrew language thing, as a language specialist over here, drives me bananas. It's not a language. Never was a language. It's not a thing. You think people would run out and study Greek? The language that of the book that Jesus was quoting from? If they don't. This is how crazy we are. It's how crazy it is out there. And they have to admit that Jesus's mission really had nothing to do with the priesthood and everything to do. Either one of them, okay? not the temple priesthood and not the Roman priesthood. Jesus wasn't had anything to do with either of those. His mission was northern Israel restoration so he could merge them with southern peasantry and restore all 12 tribes together. That's the mission. We forget that. He didn't do it speaking Hebrew, okay? That's the first thing. If they understand this, then Judaism and Christianity both lose their continuity claims. So they keep it linguistic instead of political. And this, guys, hear me clear. This is why, quote unquote, Hebrew has been designated a legitimate ancient language and why it's so important. Such an important modern linguistic invention. Because if they don't have a language, they don't have validity. Everyone was using Greek. Everyone was quoting Greek, except this tiny little faction. And they're like, well, we want to make it look like our faction was the most important one. So, this language that didn't exist, let's make that. And then everyone goes, let's chase the language of the priesthood. Like, what are you doing? If there is no Hebrew, guys, it shows that the priesthood did not have the control people want to think that it did. It wasn't the majority. This invented Hebrew gives them legitimacy that they never had. There's massive historical evidence in archaeology, linguistics that they don't seem to want to look at, demographic, political. But the Septuagint-Targum divide reflects two completely different populations, completely different textual traditions, completely different theologies, two different claims to what Israel's quote-unquote real heritage is. And you can choose the priesthood or you can choose the commoners. Just like Jesus in Luke, we just finished over in Luke, Jesus is siding people up. You can go with them and run around and learn your Masoretic Hebrew. Go chase your Levitical stuff. Or you can go with us, the commoners, the guys with fish guts on their shirt who don't speak Hebrew. They speak Aramaic and they speak Greek. They're using a Greek Bible. Go with them. Scholars deny this because it threatens rabbinic Judaism's claim to be ancient Israel. It threatens Christianity's claim to fulfill ancient Israel. And it threatens the entire, quote-unquote, Judeo-Christian continuity myth, which again is a priesthood, not a movement. It's nothing to do with Jesus. It has everything to do with passing the scepter from one priesthood to the other. Yeah, that's what it is. So next time, we're going to take a look at the Memra, which is the post-Persian nightmare nobody wants to discuss, and how this is related to the word, the mediator, and the logos, and how does all that work out? Because when we talk about the evolution of the logos, the easy Logos 101 is Plato, Philo, Paul. It's a great thing. Darn Hellenists, don't worry about it. But wait, there's more. And that will lead us into why were the Hellenists trying to kill Paul? Finally, we'll learn the answer to that. And we'll see you next time.
Energy. Energy. You cannot fuck with this. Energy. You cannot fuck with this energy.